for reasons we could not understand, to remain. People, seeing a fisher, said quietly that perhaps the ledger was not unerring after all. I chose not to tell them what else I had learned, that the ledger is not destiny because it is written, but destiny because people agree to read it as such. There are nights when the city becomes thinner, like a page poured over until words begin to show through from the other side and confuse the reader. On those nights I sit at my counter, candle guttering, and I pretend that every list is just a list. I count the ways people go on believing. I count the ways belief itself can be distributed like a contraband. I make notes in the margins of my mind. I tuck loose papers into books like seeds. The ledger teaches me that naming can be a weapon, that it can be used to secure a republic or to terrify a neighborhood. The lesson is a double one: names fix and names free. My work now is to decide which act of naming I will choose, to hold these pages and let their names hang like judgment, or to throw them into a new light and show them as the handiwork of men who prefer order to mercy. In the back of my throat a question has begun its slow burn. If belief begets power, who will dare to change the thing believed? When I close the shop, I lock the outer gate and sit with my ledger in my lap. I do not read it for prophecy so much as for pattern. The names repeat in rhythms, trades cluster, age brackets sing, the tribunal has certain tastes. The ledger is a mirror of those appetites. It delights in people who are both visible and vulnerable. I make another copy that night, and in the space between the letters I find a resolution. We will not yet call to arms. We will not yet burn down a tribunal. We will learn the machinery. We will plant counter-narratives like secret seeds. We will move a name here and a rumor there and watch whether the city will eat the lie. If the city eats the lie, then perhaps we can feed it a better story. But better stories have a cost. It is a private, stubborn plan, and it begins with the small things: a rumor in a laundress ear, a misplaced docket, a salon remark that sounds like a mistake. And yet the ledger teaches me that small things, once written and believed, have teeth. At the end of the night I place my copied page under a false bottom and press my hand over it like a woman pressing a child's fevered brow. Fear keeps to itself for a season, and I count those seasons like beads. Outside in the dark a cart rolled by, and the sound of wood on wet stone made the world seem narrower. The city is learning to speak in lists. We are learning how to answer. The name of my next step is patience, and the ledger's rope tightens another twist around the hollow of my choice. When I finally turn out the lamp, the last thing I see is a smear of ink drying on my thumbnail. It is a small, stubborn mark, the sort that does not wash away. I sleep with the ledger not on the pillow that would be foolish, but beneath my mattress like a seed bank. I know, with a clarity that belongs to those who have read too closely, that knowledge does not simply illuminate, it binds. The work is to learn how to use binding to release rather than to hang. In the morning the street smelled of rain and copper. The guillotine's shadow crossed the market like a prophecy. People moved as if they carried the knowledge of their names in their pockets. I met Bastian at the corner. His eyes were quick and his hands faster. He had news. Someone had taken a piece of paper and folded it just so. It might be nothing. It might be the beginning of something. I tucked the ledger copy further into my coat and walked on, listening for the city's next pronunciation. The hook of what comes next is simple and awful. Belief, once supplied, can be siphoned. But who dares siphon it? And at what price? I learned in the peculiar arithmetic of the shop that triumphs are measured in the thickness of a throat swallow, and in the way a hand that has been steady for years will tremble at a stroke of luck. We had made so many small arrangements by then that the idea of forging a name at first felt almost domestic: a trimming of a margin, the substitution of a hairline, a clean fold. Yet the ledger we had come to know was a thing of public consequence, a registry that braided the private into the civic. To falsify one of its tangles was to put an engine into the hands of a child with instructions that might be read one way and then another. I had the feeling, the night we decided to try, that we were neither brave nor clever in a grand way, only determined and therefore dangerous. Tiny's shop smelled of hot metal and damp rags, a scent that to me was as good as any church's incense. He kept his presses near the back, where the chimney drew smoke in a particular slow way that softened the lamplight. The press had an appetite for secrecy. It ate by the light of one lamp and left the floors strewn with proofs that looked like small wastelands of thought-typeset sentences with their errors, the ghostly blurs where ink had pooled. We met there by arrangement that carried about it the obviousness of conspiracy, the cartwheel of the clock at 2, the clink of a cup set down too hard. "You know what you ask me to do," Tyne said, as we stood over the case. His voice had the worn tenderness of an instrument that has been often used. He feared the press as a man might fear an honest sword. There is a certain kind of fear that sharpens rather than blunts. He had that kind in him. "You want me to make the tribunal's words look like their own handwriting." "Not their handwriting," I said. "Their logic, their rhythm. The ledger reads like law because it repeats its own grammar. If the grammar falters for a morning, people will look up from their bread." Lucy had pressed between us, her face bright with the impatience of youth. She would have taken the place of a bellows if that had been possible. She expanded the air around the plan until it seemed inevitable. "They say a name once," she said. "We say another twice. Who will believe which? That is the test." I watched Tien take type, line by line. He set the letters with his left hand, as if he were arranging bones, careful, respectful, a craftsman's cadence. He was good at making things seem to have been made by accident. Scrapes, slight irregularities in spacing, an ink blot in the margin, all the signs of a bureaucratic product. "We cannot be too clean," he told me. "A ledger for the tribunal is clumsy. It must look like a thing that has been handled by dozens of clerks and by the fatigue of 100 nights. If it is too precious, it will look false at a glance." We argued over which names to alter. The ethics of that decision sat on the table between us like a plate of uneaten bread. In the end, the choice had to be strategic rather than sentimental. We chose men who had the shape of a neighborhood about them, small tradesmen, a boy who hawked fish, a man who mended shoes, names that would be missed by few and noticed by many. Our aim was not to save the famous, but to disturb the calculus of the tribunal. If the public were to suspect the ledger's inviolability, even in an instance, they might begin to check it themselves. It was a modest aspiration and a treacherous one. Tien mixed his inks as a painter might decide on a particular darkness. He insisted on using a stock of paper that had been washed and smoothed, a sheet that smelled faintly of starch and river water. To the unlearned touch it would feel official. To the clerk's eye it would appear as though it had been taken from a municipal roll, rather than from a common pamphlet. He set the types carefully, his face close to the case, and when the letters came off the form they were, magnificently and worrying, believable. At some point, while the press whispered, Tien paused and told us a fragment of a life that had been folded into his hands. The memory of a sister with hair like a black ribbon who had been taken on an accusation that had no more reason than a rumor. He pressed his thumbs into the wood of the composing stick and said, simply, "I do not wish for the thing that took my sister to be the only book the city reads." There was a crack in his voice, and for a moment the press made no noise, and the world beyond the chimney's mouth held its breath. The counterfeit itself was a careful thing. We mimicked the ledger's columns, its neat numerals, its way of assigning occupations, as if the profession were a sentence that might speak for the whole man. We attached the false names with the same ink and left a small smudge at the corner to imply the hurried hand of a clerk. Lucy folded the pages into small, unobtrusive rectangles that could be tucked into a sleeve, pinched between loaves, or slipped under a laundry line. "It must carry like a coin," she said. It must be made so that it changes hands and is lost and found again. Distribution was its own small theology. We spoke with Bastien in the doorway of the market, a place where a boy's life is commerce itself. He took the folded lists in a pocket and walked off with the confidence of someone who knew how to be invisible amid noise. He sold news, but news is a porous thing. It passes from mouth to ear like water through a sieve. We entrusted him with the risky job of scattering our pages, where the crowd would pick them up with the same instinct as a beggar or a baker reaches for spare coin. Madeleine, who still had a salon's wit about her even as the city ate its fashions, whispered suggestions about how to place the documents so that they looked accidental, tucked behind the back of a stall, pinned to a parcel, slipped between the leaves of a Bible tied up for charity. Hortense promised to let a sheet dry on the line at the laundromat in such a way that a clerk might notice it as he passed, and then, as if by chance, bend to straighten his collar and look more closely. The distribution of a falsified sheet, we agreed, must imitate the random geometry of rumor itself. The morning we chose to let the leaflets go was raw, the air cut with a wind that smelled of horse and river. There was a grey, last light stillness before the market's engines warmed, the kind of half-silence in which small conspiracies are easiest to keep. Bastien moved like a shadow among stalls, an accomplished thief of moments. Lucy walked the bakery row with the purposeful gait of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere. She slipped a folded page into the hand of a woman buying eggs with a firm, practiced motion. I stood by my shop front and counted how many pairs of shoes passed by in an hour and how many nods came with them. When the procession to the scaffold began, people had already found the lists. They read them and folded them again with the reverence others reserve for pamphlets. Rumor, as we had hoped, took the page and carried it. You know what watching a rumor happen feels like, a shiver that travels along a spine of faces. In the square, the tribunal's clerk read the named list with the same old cadence. His voice was a metronome that ordered the city for the moment. Then someone near the steps cried out, as if stunned by a syllable, and then someone else. Heads turned. A woman in a brown cloak pushed forward, clutching a folded scrap, and demanded to know why the ledger and this paper named different men. There was a beat of confusion, the thing that makes the human throat cool for an instant, and then an improvisation. The clerk read again, slower now. People compared hands, voices rose. The soldiers who guarded the scaffold looked the commissaire for instruction. A man in a ragged coat, one of those names we had selected for the sake of geography, rather than heroism, saw the space the confusion opened, and, hand in hand with a woman whose face I knew by its stubborn profile, slipped down a side alley. I watched as the woman guided him along with a small, fierce tenderness, as if she were stitching a seam shut behind him. For a moment the city felt newly porous. Certainty had a seam. Afterward, in the shop, we uncorked a bottle that had once been used for vinegar and drank, as if we had earned a sacrament. The room smelled of ink and bread and the oily breath of the press. Lucy laughed too loud, an exultation that bordered on something like terror. Bastien sat with a newsboy's glee and kept stroking the folded scrap in his pocket, as if to remind himself that the morning had happened. We had done it. The ledger had been embarrassed in public, and its authority, for a few hours at least, was questionable. But triumph is a fragile currency. By noon the bird of suspicion had found a perch in my chest. Words move quickly when they smell of scandal, and Renaud's name arrived with the weight of a sentence. We had not been careful in every aspect. Someone had seen Lucy move along the baker's row. Hortense's hands shook at the laundromat, and she had told a neighbor, who told a clerk, who told a clerk's wife, and the rumor among the municipal offices hardened into a tension. When men of the tribunal began to pore over records that had previously been left unattended, the city contracted around us. The very fact that we had succeeded made the apparatus pay us the compliment of taking notice. In the days that followed, more came to us like flies to honey, faces we had not known were watching. Questions that asked less about the morality of our act than about the method. How did they do it? The watchers asked in the market. Who is clever enough to tame the ledger? Each question was a finger tracing the seam of our small success, looking for the weak place. We had opened a pane in a house of glass. The wind entered and would not be easily shut out. Tyne grew more withdrawn. He worked with a clench in his jaw, as if the press had become a beast that might at any time bite him. "They will check the margins," he muttered. "They will call the paper by its watermark. They will watch the printers. They will think to burn what cannot be accounted for." He began to hide more plates in his chimney, and I felt the old story of his sister like a shadow that might elongate and swallow us. Lucy, who had spent the morning like a woman who had tasted a new hymn, now sat silently, her eyes hollow with a knowledge that had cost something. Madeleine's salon offered its small protections. She sent a note to a woman of a particular station who still owned a friend in the tribunal's clerical offices. The note was a pale thing, an inquiry couched as a gossiping compliment, and it bought us a few hours of complacency in a place where complacency is currency. But gifts like that are paid for later, sometimes with the very commodity they bought, and I felt the weight of a balance sheet I could not always read. So the victory, when it arrived, was both real and incomplete. We had proven, in a public square, that a ledger could be made to misfire. We had shown that the city's acceptance of a list was contingent, not mystical. But proving something to the world is not the same as changing the world. The tribunal is a patient institution. It keeps ledgers and it keeps records, and patient institutions learn where they can be hurt and then take measures against that wound. I understood this in the small way one understands after a long illness. You can cut back on one symptom, but the body will find another. Renaud tightened his nets. Clerks were watched, paper was inspected, and we, who had once thought ourselves nimble, began to feel the net's edges brush our limbs. I slept poorly that night, with the counterfeit list folded beneath my mattress like a heart. It beat there, a steady, small thing. We had bought breathing space for a handful of people. We had learned how belief could be shifted by a single piece of paper. Yet all the while I could hear, as if under the floorboards, the ledger's patient counting. The city had learned to doubt, which is something like a beginning, but the ledger had also learned to watch. In the weeks that followed, our network grew, a new hawker, a seamstress who would tuck a page into a hem, a journeyman who pretended to be clumsy and thus left a scrap of paper in his wake. People who cared for nothing except survival learned to place a folded sheet with the intuition of a practiced hand. Our acts became more confident and therefore more dangerous. Each new success widened the circle of eyes that counted us. There is a particular kind of joy in seeing a plan obey its own logic. It comes with a small, private ruin, the knowledge that what is creative can become formulaic. We learned to falsify the ledger not as an act of singular heroism but as a craft. Where once Tyne's hands trembled, they now moved with the slowness of habit. Lucy, who once hinted at songs on the square, now taught other apprentices how to fold a page so that a clerk would be fooled by its creases. The network became in this way more efficient and also more predictable. And predictability is the enemy of secrecy. The more we practiced the art of misnaming fate, the more likely it became that someone would also practice the art of catching us. Renaud would sharpen, we suspected, his gaze at the points where we were most confident. The ledger, which had been a thing we had once thought of as iron and immutable, was now an object of contention and craft. We had succeeded. The tribunal noticed. The next move would not be ours alone. When I closed the shop at dusk and ran my hand across the counters, I felt as one who has sewn a seam and then, having seen how the thread runs, wonders whether the stitch will hold. The city had been changed, not impossibly but uncomfortably. Some would say we had done a brave thing, and some might say a foolish one. I could not yet know which verdict would be more true. I only knew that the ledger had been shown to be manipulable, that names could be argued with as if they were propositions in a margin, and that a city's belief is a fragile, unscrupulous thing. The hook that pulled the rest of us forward was not the triumph itself, but the knowledge that we had learned something the state could not unlearn overnight, that authority's power lies in its acceptance, and acceptance can be eroded by a single, stubborn paper. We had given doubt its first breath. Whether it would live or choke would depend on what we were willing to risk next. The press room is warmer than the street, not by much. Paris in that year is always a poor heater, but the small brazier in Tyne's corner threw a soft, stubborn light that turned ink into a glossy black, like the throat of a new book. I had always known the smell of a press, oil and hot iron, wet rag and the sour sweetness of folding paper. It is a smell that claims you slowly. It is the smell of work done to the bone and of sentences set into a kind of public muscle. I stood in it for a long time and listened, the way a reader listens when a sentence refuses to give up its meaning at once. Tyne moved around me like a man who has learned to perform his fear with exact gestures: lift plate, smear ink, proof, fold, stack. Each motion had the necessary economy of habit, nothing showy, everything efficient. He lit the brazier as if he were lighting a ritual. The light fell on his hands, and the small scars that tell of presses misaligned and fingers too close to the type. You should not come at dawn, he said, not as a reprimand, but as a fact of trade. Dawn is for the clerks and for the commissaire who thinks the city is cleaner then. He had the voice of someone who names days carefully. There is a grammar to fear and to method. He had learned both. I had come because letters are always a kind of answer, and because the ledger in my shop made questions that could only be answered in print and in counterprint. I told him what I had found, the ledger's first names and the queer, clinical way it recorded dates as if time were an accounting matter. He rubbed his thumb over the rim of a plate and made a face that was part disgust and part calculation. They write certainty into being, then punish those it names, he said. And men like Renaud read it as though the ink were law. There are conversations that will not be had in daylight. We sat in the press room and began them. Tyne had a lamp, an old and honest thing whose glass had been clouded many times. Its flame trembled as if afraid to be seen. He showed me a shelf where he kept proof single leaves that had not passed muster, plates that bore tiny errors, the sort of misprints that reveal more than they hide. He touched a proof with the same tenderness a bookseller might give a child. Error is a kind of truth, he said. At times you can hide in it. Then he performed for me what was to become the chapter's private liturgy. He took a stack of plates, thin copper, their faces scored with the neat rows of type, and he slid them into his hands as if they were something both fragile and vile. He rubbed the edges, counted them almost without meaning to, and carried them to the hearth. The chimney there was not so much a flue as a repository. He had hollowed out a cavity behind worn brick, a place where a man can tuck a secret and then deny its existence with the thickest of lies. He pried at mortar with a small chisel until a sliver of space yielded, and then he slid the plates inside. The sound they made metal on stone was like a bone tapped for echoes. I have known men who hide money, who hide women, who hide shame. I had not seen him hide his tools of trade as if they were contraband. There are rosters that could mean nothing, he said, closing his palm over the mouth of the cavity. And there are rosters that are a noose. Once the state writes a name it expects to see that name tied. I will not let my plates be the rope. For a long time he worked in that silence, pressing mortar with his thumb, smoothing the seam until the difference was only a seam to the careless eye. It was then he told me about his sister. There is no good way to tell a story of loss. It will always sound like an accusation or like a failing, and the heart wants to crouch before both. His sister had been small-boned and quick with a laugh that made men look foolish. She sold ribbons at the market and rid the scraps of the day to the women who could not spare a denier for a pamphlet. Once, when the city was quieter and less sharp, she lured him home with a tray of tea and bread. Later she was taken at dawn, snatched in a rumple of coats, and a knock delivered as if law were merely a visiting card, and accused of conspiring with an Miga. They read her a name out of the ledger, and the ledger named her as if it were a ledger's duty. He searched the municipal registers. He pulled every piece of offal the bureaucracy kept, and tried to make it sound like a case. They offered him indigence in exchange for silence, threats in exchange for pretending he had never known her. He chose the workbench. He chose to learn the press with the idea that if he could understand how lists were made, he could make them bend. He spoke of her in a plain voice, dropping a clumsy joke once to see if grief might be absolved by laughter, and catching himself the way a man misplaces his step. "I am good at making letters do what I intend," he said, "but I am not the magistrate. I cannot make the tribunal see reason. I can only move what they read." There is in such statements an ethical economy, a recognition that craft does not equal justice, but that a craft turned with cunning might buy hours and years. I listened and catalogued as a bookseller does. I measure grief in small indexes, the cadence of a name, the halting of a sentence, the way a man avoids mentioning the street where a woman once stood. His confession was not confessional in the clerical sense. It was a fact offered as proof of motive. I do not like to be shown motive as though motive clears the moral ledger. A motive can be an excuse. Yet in the pressroom's heat, his motive looked less like an excuse and more like a map. He showed me his method for altering a public register. The plate must be adulterated so that an official reading it will not suspect tampering. You do not strike through a name in capital letters. You soften a stroke, you make a clerical flourish here and there, you place a smudge of ink that looks like humidity. The public reads hurriedly. Those who execute will look for formal fault and not for nuance. The skill is not barbarous. It is a quiet robbery of attention. A man who reads every line in the tribunal, Tyne said, will find the forgery only when he looks for it as a criminal would. He inked a plate with a practiced hand and pressed a proof. The press took the sheet in its jaws as if it were swallowing a secret, and then it struck and spat out a leaf that smelled of oil and of a false authority. We examined it. Under the lamplight the smear looked like any other, plausible, bureaucratic, respectable. "You see," he said. "You see how the lie takes the posture of truth. This work is not without its immediate terrors. A man who forges municipal lists must keep his shop neat of suspicion. He must bribe the right clerk with the right book. He must be able to produce a legitimate job at a moment's notice. And he must maintain the face of ordinary clientele, market women, the odd student, a priest who has bad handwriting and a need for hymnals." For Tian, the shop was a theater in which normalcy was performed with an artisan's dignity. "We are craftsmen," he said, "which is to say we are liars with better paperwork." He laughed then a little, but the laugh did not have the liquid comfort of truth. It sat dry and explanative as a footnote. There is also in such work a danger that is not simply the law. The printer's body cannot be safely split between two lives without both halves catching flint. He will get tired. He will make a mark that reads as a clue. He will be tempted, like all men who work with letters, to claim superiority in craft, to misjudge the savviness of the men who run the tribunal. I thought of Renaud's ledger as an altar. The tribunal priesthood clerks and counters and men with ink-stained thumbs tend that altar. To challenge the altar you must be both pious and obscene. We spoke of margins. I have always loved margins. They are where resistance lives. A book's margin keeps the scribble of thought that will not be authorized. Tyne and I argued whether a marginalia could be more dangerous than a forgery. If a marginal note offers counsel where the list offers decree, he said, tapping the rim of a plate, then we have a double strategy, tectonics of text and of room.